A very big welcome to everybody. Welcome to this Issara Institute webinar. My name is Tim Pilch, and I have great pleasure in moderating this conversation we're about to have. We are very lucky to have an extremely well-informed panel of guests with a variety of experiences to share with us. But before we jump in, can I just go through a few points and the format for this conversation? The webinar will be recorded and will be posted to Issara's website and YouTube channel. We've got a global network of stakeholders and many who are currently sleeping, and they'll be wanting to catch up with the content in due course. We will start by allowing each of our panelists to provide insights into their experiences, some examples and their opinions. And this will be followed by a big window of opportunity for all participants to join the conversation, for you to ask questions, provide your experiences and your opinions. I'm sure everyone would rather hear voices, and we'd be very pleased if you want to turn on your webcam, but if you would rather remain anonymous, please use the chat box to forward any questions to me, Tim Pilch, the host, and I'll attempt to get as many addressed by the panel. So today we'll be exploring the effectiveness of both state and non-state channels for remedying abuses to workers in global supply chains. What are the responsibilities and the expectations of governments, and what are the responsibilities and expectations of business? Obviously, with regard to human rights, to forced labour, human trafficking, modern slavery. I mean, what have we learned in nearly 10 years since the Ruggie Principles, the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, which were launched in 2011? How does access to remedy play out in reality for exploited workers around the world? And what is the current state and future potential for workers in global supply chains to consistently have access to remedy? So I'd like to start by introducing each of our panel, and at the same time ask them to provide their initial thoughts and related experiences. So I'm going to start with Mike Dottridge, who probably won't appreciate being reminded that he has worked in human rights for 4 decades. He has worked for both Amnesty International and Anti-Slavery International, where he was the director from 1996 until 2002. Mike's focus is on the rights of adults and children subjected to economic or sexual exploitation. And he's undertaken evaluations and institutional learning exercises for both international organizations and NGOs. So over to you, Mike, to kick us off, please.
Thanks very much, Tim. Let me mention also that I have as it were, an organic link to Issara, as I'm a member of the board of directors. But really here this afternoon, I want to share my experience in looking at issues of grievances, looking for remedies. I was doing that for 2 decades before I became a staff member of Anti-Slavery International in the 1990s, but doing it in the context of civil and political rights. And initially it didn't seem entirely different in the 1990s, looking for solutions which generally meant, first of all, paying a great deal of attention to what was actually happening. Nowadays, we probably call it research, but documenting facts and trying to separate fact from fiction. I've been involved, I suppose, at various different levels. At one extreme level, in the context of Brazil, testifying to a regional human rights court, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, about a case of forced labor in Brazil. The court looked at the case only 4 years ago, but it had started back in the 1990s. So we were presenting evidence about 2 decades worth of abuse in Brazil's Amazonia on things that became ranches, but initially were just patches of forest where slave labor was used to clear it. And at the other end of the spectrum, I suppose it's where my interest is really in non-judicial operational level grievance mechanisms. And my first involvement was with domestic workers, particularly child domestic workers. How do you enable a 10-year-old to negotiate with an abusive employer? Evidently, that's a huge challenge, especially in the world of work where we don't think 10-year-olds should be there in the first place. When you're looking for really practical solutions to improve people's lives, then yes, the challenge is to look at ways of enabling them to get their voice heard. And I think that's still our challenge today, particularly in today's conversation, is to look at how to deal with the complete imbalance in power between people who are being exploited and those who exploit them, or those who put them to work and potentially are not very inclined to listen either to their grievances or to their claims in any sort of negotiation. In the last 20 years since I left anti-slavery, I've been involved in documenting all sorts of grievance mechanisms. I won't talk about them now, but some looked successful initially. I'm thinking of several cases where groups of migrant workers were able to join trade unions or were able to negotiate. And yet over the longer term, that particular solution has fallen to pieces. So I've learned early on that there's no magic bullet in terms of the actual mechanism, but what we're always looking at is how to rebalance the power dynamics between people. Right, that's all for me for the moment. Thanks very much.
Unmute myself would help. Thanks very much, Mike. Now I would like to introduce Caroline Robinson. So Caroline is an independent expert on labour exploitation, an area she's worked in for over a decade, including co-founding the leading anti-labour exploitation charity, Focus on Labour Exploitation, or FLEX, as we all know it in the UK. So Caroline founded FLEX in the UK in 2013 and directed the charity until 2019. So Caroline, please can we hear your thoughts?
Thanks a lot, Tim, and hi to everyone. It's a bit daunting not being able to see everyone's faces, but if you're there, hi. So I'm based in Scotland, actually, and I'm working particularly on agriculture at the moment on a project funded by the Scottish Government in relation to changes that have been introduced by the UK government in relation to Brexit. But yeah, as Tim said, I've worked at the global and local level when I was working for the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, and then established Focus on Labour Exploitation with Claire Falconer here in the UK. And throughout this work, I have mainly been focused in in my master's as well on participation, and in this field, worker and survivor participation in policy and legal frameworks. And so on access to remedy in global supply chains, I'll briefly frame my experience in two areas. So firstly, the Ruggie Principles note the importance of meaningful consultation with potentially affected groups. And that to me, I think is critical. The work I've carried out with workers over the past decade has shown how crucial this is. Worker experiences are different, workplaces are experienced differently, obstacles to remedy shift in time and for different categories of workers. And that brings me to the second point, which is the link between state-based mechanisms and non-state mechanisms, I think is critical. Businesses should be acutely aware of what exists for workers at the state level and how well it's functioning and to what degree workers are protected. Where progress has been made, and I know that we were to talk about progress. I want to do that before I get onto a couple of negatives. I'd say it's largely, I think you can look to worker level initiatives. So leaps in supply chain oversight that have come from organizations like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the Fair Food Programme in the USA, or the growing power and success of independent trade unions in the UK, like the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain and United Voices of the World. So throughout the research I've been doing in UK supply chains, including construction, fishing and agriculture, it's clear that by design or default, many key actors in the supply chain are avoiding hearing from workers. And jumping to an example of that in UK agriculture at the moment, just to give something tangible, we've seen a huge shift to UK supply chains in introduction of a new seasonal worker visa, workers coming from outside the EU to agriculture, rapidly increased short notice demand due to COVID-19, and possible further huge shifts due to Brexit and trade deals. And all the while reduced interaction with seasonal workers and with workers in agriculture. And this has come from reductions in resources to labour market enforcement since 2010, and then a redirection of focus as well since 2014, declining unionisation and limited reporting channels and time to report for those on short-term 6-month visas. And then that's been compounded really in the last 8 months by COVID-19, leading to isolation and separation of agricultural workers from the general population. National insurance numbers are not being issued, GP appointments are not taking place, frontline inspections are not happening. So without any means of workers to raise concerns or report abuses, workers are entering into increasing positions of vulnerability, and these changes are unfolding in the workplace. So I suppose to illustrate that businesses and states really need to hear from workers in the supply chain about evolving situations and changing situations in the workplace. And in a sector like agriculture, this could mean finding out about the debts that workers have taken out, the impact of the immigration regime on their ability to repay that debt, and essentially the impact of that debt on the likelihood of workers reporting abuses and seeking remedy. And then briefly, the second point I highlighted is the need for awareness and interaction between state and non-state grievance processes. And that's something that I've worked on for many years, looking at labour market governance and labour market enforcement, and the importance of ensuring that policies aimed at tackling labour shortages in a country, and I know many businesses are clamouring, especially in the UK at the moment, to do something to address the future impact of labour shortages, are also coupled with protective policies that ensure access to remedy. And I think that can be left behind in advocacy and attempts to address those labour shortages. So briefly, I'll use the UK as an example again. We have a cliff edge facing us in terms of free movement.
I'm sorry, it's Kate. We'll hand it back to you.
In terms of free movement of workers ending in December. And a sector that's been particularly vocal is agriculture. So we've had this short-term visa introduced in the UK to address this, to try and tackle the problem. At the moment, it's a pilot, a 6-month visa for workers to come to the UK. But workers with different migration statuses, and particularly circular and temporary migration programs, have more or less power in the workplace. There are changes that have an impact on worker vulnerability. And we've seen that in Spain with the workers in agriculture and circular migration schemes for many years. GapW was looking at that for the last decade. We've seen that in the USA, and I mentioned the Fair Food Programme, and that's certainly something that's been addressed a little by that. And then Australia's also found exploitation in circular migration programs. So the changes in migration regimes that are introduced by governments need to be central to responses to worker abuse and access to remedy frameworks, and a clear understanding by the private sector and by governments of how each actor is responding to these changes and what's happening in different supply chains is critical. And so just to finalise, I think to tackle this as a business, particularly enhanced communication measures should be put in place to hear from marginalised categories of workers, specific requests to auditors to random sample workers from specific visa categories and marginalised groups, and clear engagement with worker support groups that are talking to workers on a regular basis and engaging with particularly new categories of workers that might be particularly marginalised to understand specific risks are some steps forward, but I can talk more afterwards.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Next, we're going to move on to Anders. So thanks for joining us, Anders. Anders Lisborg is our only non-UK resident panelist. So he's joining us from Copenhagen. Welcome, Anders. Anders is an international expert on business and human rights. He's a specialist in migration management and anti-trafficking with 20 years experience working in more than 25 countries. So he's currently a director and co-founder of Migration Management Advice, MMA International for short, who are an independent consultancy specializing in migration, security, and international development. So Anders has also held positions with the ILO, the International Centre for Migration Policy Development, and has worked as a special advisor to the Danish police. Anders, please can we hear from you?
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for the invitation to be on this webinar. And greetings from Denmark. I'll start out. I'll try to start out with a kind of a bird perspective on this topic. It's almost 10 years ago since the Ruggie Principles, but it's also 20 years ago since the Palermo Protocol on trafficking. So a lot of us, including myself, who actually started out or who works in business and human rights now, we started out working on combating trafficking back in the 90s or the early 2000s and so on. So if we go back and take stock from there, there are actually, in my view, a lot of positive developments, just to start on a positive note. I mean, before 25 years ago, very few people knew or cared about trafficking, human trafficking, and all these issues that we're discussing now. Today, most people and businesses know about trafficking and modern slavery, and it's fairly high on the agenda, both among states and businesses. 15 years ago, if we move a little bit up in history and time, it was mainly about sexual exploitation of children. So a lot of us who worked on anti-trafficking many years ago were focusing on sexual exploitation. And now we see today it's all recognized that there's labor exploitation taking place in formal businesses and within all kinds of sectors worldwide. So if you go further up, 10 years ago, before the Ruggie Principles, very few addressed exploitations in the global supply chains. And today it's a huge issue and a hot topic for both businesses and governments. 10 years ago as well, the private sector was not really deeply engaged in the fight against trafficking, and it wasn't really linked to business and human rights. So today, again, most businesses and companies and brands are engaged in addressing exploitation in global supply chains. So 5 years ago, not so fairly recently, there were a limited number of organizations were involved in this, and today we see a growing number of organizations being involved and making a real difference for vulnerable workers on the ground. We have Issara, Elevate, Alula, Quizar, Mekong Club, and so on, just to mention a few. So there's a lot of kind of new organization mushrooming addressing this issue jointly with businesses and so forth. Also 5 years ago, there were limited legislation and regulation, and today we see a lot of new legislations and regulations coming out since the California Transparency Act to the Modern Slavery Act, but also more or less similar legislative initiatives from France, Australia, Holland, and so on, and currently being debated in the EU as well. So there's a lot of developments in that regard. It's also my impressions from working within working with businesses in the global supply chains that there's a lot of businesses, both global buyers and also local producers, being very interested in setting up grievance mechanisms. So all of this all together, and to sum it up in a way, it's quite positive and quite good if we look at it throughout history, throughout the last not only 10 but 20 years. That said, of course, there's still a lot of systematic and serious exploitation taking place, and there's still a lot of risks that some of the above mentioned positive developments, like the new legislation and the setting up of grievance mechanisms, ends up being a mock-up for covering continuing exploitation as we still see it. We have over the years seen a lot of countries getting the right anti-trafficking policies and legal frameworks in place, but without seeing necessarily the positive changes in reality on the ground without making much difference for vulnerable people and workers. Thus, in my view, there's still a lot of ongoing challenges to translate all the good initiatives that I mentioned just before, both from governments and from businesses and from NGOs, into measurable and real impact on the ground that makes a difference for the workers. Businesses can fairly easily set up grievance and complaint mechanisms. It's more difficult to make them effective, legitimate, transparent, and to make the mechanisms work for the vulnerable people they are supposed to benefit in the reality. So with that, I just, as an introduction, I think I'll leave it there. And I have some more kind of comments on some of the serious challenges and pitfalls we also see in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anders. Last but definitely not least, I'd like to welcome Owain Johnstone. So Owain is policy advisor at the ETI, the Ethical Trading Initiative here in London, and previously a UK government policy advisor. So we've asked Owain to join this panel because he's been heavily involved in ongoing ETI access to a specific ETI access to remedy project funded by the UK government. And I'll let Owain provide insight into the ETI said access to remedy guidelines project and perhaps mention ETI's access to remedy guidelines that were published in 2019. So thank you, Owain.
Thanks very much, Tim. And thank you very much for having me today. So I'll briefly introduce ETI for anyone not familiar with the organisation. We're a UK-based membership organisation. We have just over 90 corporate members and a smaller number of NGO and trade union members in various sectors. And we work to improve labour standards in supply chains around the world. We have offices in Bangladesh and India, and we work more widely in other countries as well. One of the things we do as a membership organisation is run projects in collaboration with our members. And it's one of those projects that I want to briefly talk about today. As Tim said, this is quite a specific targeted project. And I hope it picks up on that last point that Anders made in a way that it is about one specific issue or challenge when it comes to enabling access to remedy for workers. So this is a 2-year project funded by the UK government's Modern Slavery Innovation Fund, which began in April last year, so comes to an end next March. And it's focused on enabling access to remedy for migrant workers specifically. The kind of challenge motivating the project initially was the understanding that not only are migrant workers particularly vulnerable to various forms of exploitation, but they're also perhaps less likely to be able or willing to access some conventional grievance mechanisms, whether that be because of a language barrier or a trust barrier, or that they are in a situation perhaps of debt bondage and don't want to risk raising an issue in or through a mechanism that they don't fully trust. So this 2-year project was designed as a pilot project to explore how meaningful access to remedy could be provided specifically to that group. And the project falls into 2 parts. There's a policy component in which we've developed a short set of access to remedy principles for migrant workers. We'll be publishing these hopefully by the end of the year. And they build on what Tim mentioned, which was ETI's more comprehensive access to remedy guidance, which we published last year. These principles are a sort of more specific addition, and they try to set out at a fairly high level key roles and responsibilities in establishing a grievance mechanism that we think will make it more likely to work for migrant workers. So we've drafted and consulted widely on those. We're now finalising the text, and we'll be able to share those very shortly. The second component of the programme is, in a way, a pilot of those principles. We're working in Malaysia with 2 companies in the rubber goods manufacturing sector to develop a mobile app, which we will be piloting with migrant workers in a number of factories. which we hope will support access to remedy for that group. And our sort of governing principle, I suppose, in developing that app and running this pilot has been, how can we develop a tool that is as worker-centered as possible and as trusted by the workers as possible? We know that there are a lot of grievance mechanisms out there in all sorts of different forms, and we wanted to make sure that the workers in the pilot group trust and use whatever we develop. So we spent some time recruiting a local team of migrant community leaders through our local partner NGO, Our Journey in Malaysia. We worked with them to interview workers in the factories and management to understand their perceptions of existing grievance mechanisms and their access to technology. We've used that to develop an adapted version of an app run by an organization called 58. You might be familiar with their existing app, Just Good Work. And we're just at the point where we are about to roll out that app, put it into the hands of workers and run the pilot. And we've tried to approach the project from the point of view that technology can be a useful tool in supporting workers to facilitate remedy, but it probably isn't the solution in and of itself. We've tried to design it and we'll be presenting it to workers in such a way as to say it's there to support and facilitate social dialogue and hopefully make that direct resolution of workplace issues easier. But it does also allow for third-party reporting of grievances in an anonymous way, should that be necessary because other routes aren't available for any reason. So I think that's the broad overview of the project. I'm happy to pick up on any aspects of it in more detail in response to questions, but I will leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Owain. Me struggling to work on the chat box to people sending messages and unmute myself and take notes. Thanks so much to everybody. It'd be great if the panelists could all come back online regarding videos, please. So that's our initial introductory pieces given, and now we want to widen the conversation to include everybody who's participating. So if anyone has any comments, insights or questions they'd like to share, questions they'd like to ask the panel, we've got 30 minutes for a much wider conversation. So please don't all rush forward. It'd be great to hear somebody. There's the chat box that you can use to get in touch with me, the host, Tim Pilch, or please just turn on your microphone and ask away. And I'm going to go quiet now to allow people the opportunity. I was always told never be scared of silence, but currently I'm terrified. So it seems that our panel is so brilliant that they've covered everything anybody needs to know. So luckily, Issara, can I hear somebody?
Yes, this is Cindy.
Cindy, hello. Cindy Berman.
Hi, yes. And thank you. It's lovely to be with friends on listening to all of you on this panel. And thank you for giving us the opportunity. I was just wanting to hear from people, the panel, about the most promising initiatives that you've seen so far on access to remedy for workers in meaningful ways. Tim, including from Issara, and you know, we know the problems, we know the importance of workers themselves being at the table, of building trust and ensuring access to decision makers in the right way. But I'm wondering about where there are pockets of progress, success, promise at least. If the panelists can talk to that, where they've seen that.
Thanks so much, Cindy. So any volunteers from the panel to start? Perhaps Mike.
I'll dive straight in and say that while I think our medium long-term objective is always to enable workers to get their own voices heard, to enter collective bargaining agreements and so on, that actually we know from experience that those that are locked out either because of legislation that doesn't allow migrant workers, for example, to join trade unions, or for other practical reasons, they're just pawns, as it were, in a large sector. We know that they often rely on some sort of assistance from an intermediary, not just a trafficker or a broker who gets them a job, but an organization. It might be a trade union, it might be a non-governmental organization that can provide certain services and can help them amplify their own voice. And I think the models there of what it's useful to do and what can be done that is more than just documenting abuse and putting that into the public arena, or documenting abuse in order to oblige a particular brand or a particular employer to react. What can be done that really is more positive and less confrontational, so has potentially a longer shelf life as a form of support? I think that's interesting, and I think Issara has something to offer there, but I think there have been a number of other particularly migrant support organizations around the world that have played really useful roles. I think that's enough to get us rolling.
Any other panelists would like to comment in response to Cindy?
I guess I mentioned the Fair Food Programme and worker-driven social responsibility. Many people on the call will know a lot about that. It's become very, very, well, I guess built its profile since I remember talking to a coalition of many locally workers many years ago about their work. But I think for me, especially working with workers at the moment, some of the aspects of the worker-driven social responsibility model in the Fair Food Programme, which for those that don't know, worker standards agreed by lead companies and supported by lead companies, and then a ongoing complaints mechanism available to workers that can then be accessed by workers and monitored by an independent authority that investigates and squares the circle with the lead companies again. But I think the point of that to say that for me, this channel for reporting abuse is so critical. I mean, I think I was talking particularly about workers that I find particularly marginalized due to their immigration status, or that can also be the case for undocumented workers, for women workers in some cases where there aren't gender sensitive policies in labour market enforcement particularly, and where there are those in power are men, and there are barriers to reporting in that regard. But I think that that complaints mechanism being 24 hours, being 7 days a week, and being multilingual, and so there is a outlet for reporting, but then having a clear chain for action to be taken in that Fair Food Programme model as well, but in other worker-driven social responsibility models, so that you can see the outcome of the as a worker and as other workers, so you can see the value in reporting, and you can report anonymously as well, and be assured that there will be no implications for you as an individual as well. So I think that's for me, there are key elements, there are really important elements, particularly in talking to workers about reporting a lot at the moment.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Very interesting. More questions flowing in actually now on the chat. We've got one specifically to Owain. So if maybe Owain, you need to, if you'd be kind enough to repeat which sector you're working on in Malaysia, and to advise if you're piloting the worker perspective. I'm trying to translate this in a way from both the grievance mechanism you're piloting, but are there any existing internal or external grievance systems within those suppliers that you're integrating within your system?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I think so. And maybe the questioner can just jump in if I don't quite respond to what they were asking about. So we're working with the rubber goods manufacturing sector in Malaysia, which obviously has been in the headlines somewhat this year in terms of personal protective equipment manufacture, rubber gloves in particular. Are we integrating our app into internal grievance mechanisms? No, and that's deliberate in the sense that there are some existing grievance mechanisms in the suppliers we're working with. We're not making any particular judgment on those, but our starting point for the project was that migrant workers often don't trust hotlines, complaints boxes, talking to senior management if they're not familiar with them. And so we deliberately wanted to provide something that was separate to those things, both a separate route to report issues, but also a trusted source of information for the workers, which is what the app is, on their rights and on good practice in workplace grievance raising. That is the workers. Once it's on their phone, it belongs to them. So we were very keen that what we built should feel to the worker like it belongs to them and not to their employer or to anyone else, in the hope that that would enable them to trust it and make more use of it than they otherwise might do.
Thanks, Owain. And I would concur with that. I think, you know, from my perspective, working with Issara, you know, there is no reason why there can't be several grievance mechanisms, and workers will use whichever mechanism they trust and feel will provide them with access to remedy. So, so thanks so much, Owain, for that. I've got a question for Caroline. Caroline, workers' protection in fisheries and generally global supply chains, very challenging for people working at sea, especially in high seas. Do any of the panelists, specifically Caroline, have perspectives in this specific area? Now, I know Issara do, but it's not an area that personally I'm particularly well up to date in. Caroline, yes, no?
Yeah, maybe
no,
if Lisa is,
you can say no.
she should also speak now. I was just going to add one little thing in relation to workers that are particularly isolated and have very limited contact with state enforcement, particularly, and that's becoming increasingly the case in the UK, where we have greatly reduced our state enforcement capacity. I think what Owain was saying about the app is fascinating, and what we're looking at and thinking about quite a lot is how to help workers to really document all of their experiences and to have that documentation at the ready, because I think a lot of the incidences of where workers finally do report are being challenged and questioned because of the absence of that evidence on their part, and so I think any apps and assisted features that can help workers just to gather their documentation and gather their experiences is always essential, and particularly in sectors where the workers are so isolated and have so limited such limited support, really. But yeah, I'll leave that to Lisa in relation to specific fishery measures.
I know Lisa's in the room, so to speak. So, but I'm sure if Lisa wants to make a comment on how access to remedy works, grievance works within the fishing industry, she might find an opportunity to speak up later in the chat. I'm just going to check. Sorry for this, trying to multitask for some more questions. Oh, maybe this is one, maybe from Mike might be able to look at this one. Does any of the panel have experience on the role of development banks and their mechanisms in supporting worker rights in supply chains? That might be an interesting question.
I suspect that one's largely beyond me. I was actually going to contribute on the fishing question first of all,
Please
from a European perspective, and then I'll comment on the banks. We had a real scandal in Ireland a few years ago on fishing boats there. They were employing migrants without a work permit, coming from countries such as Philippines, Ghana, Egypt. And what we learned through that process is that the judicial grievance mechanisms utterly failed to perform for the workers concerned. Eventually, the non-judicial mechanisms, and I'm thinking particularly of trade union, Irish trade union involvement, did perform. But it was a real wake-up, which is that, you know, a country that had signed the Council of Europe Convention on Action against Trafficking in Human Beings and this and that and the other, actually, when it came through it, its institutions were hopeless. Now to move on to the second question, banks. Well, it's particularly been in Asia that we've seen development banks play a role in documenting forced labor and trafficking, particularly under the label forced labor. What I can't tell you, and I don't know if anyone else today can, is whether any have played a role further down the line in terms of looking at grievance mechanisms. It would be an obvious place to go, but I haven't kept my eye on their projects recently, so I can't answer that.
Thanks so much for that. I assume from everybody else's silence, banks and investment is not their area. Me neither. Sorry, we can't go further into that. So we've got some. Oh no, so Cindy's sending that to everybody, so that's great. I'm not going to bother. It's great that Cindy's contributing so much. Thanks, Cindy. Another question. Can apps? This is a pretty good question. Can apps really serve as a grievance mechanism if it's autonomous? It helps raise the issues, but can it lead to compensation or remedy? Good question. Let's start with Owain, because you're obviously thinking about this an awful lot with this project you're involved in.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question, and actually it's something we've been discussing even recently. I think there are not a few answers. There's one answer, but there are different routes to consider. So I think one thing we've tried to place centrally in our approach to remedy is, as has already been mentioned, the importance of direct worker-employer dialogue, ideally through an independent and functioning trade union. Obviously, there's not normally a great deal of anonymity in that kind of dialogue. We have framed the app we developed to encourage that dialogue where possible, but with the option of anonymously reporting or not anonymously reporting to a third party if the worker feels more comfortable doing that. If an issue is raised to the third party NGO, then it depends on what kind of issue it is. It might be an issue where it affects a group of workers in a similar way, and then it can be raised and resolved anonymously because it can be done without identifying the worker in question. And the preferred route for resolving any issue reported would be by the NGO engaging with the employer. There might, on the other hand, be issues where, because it's affecting a single worker, there's realistically no way to escalate that without identifying, or really not no way to escalate it, but no way to obtain meaningful remedy without identifying the worker in question. And then I think, or at least it's our view in our discussion so far, that it comes down to the consent of the worker and where they are happy to be anonymized or not. That's quite a prolonged and not very simple answer, but perhaps it shares a little bit of our thinking as we've been kind of working through the different options on that.
Great, thank you. Anything from Caroline or Anders on the same subject? I know you guys have had direct involvement with workers. From my perspective, you know, I mean, safeguards are so important, but as far as apps are concerned, my quite long experience working with Issara from a business perspective, but also within Issara, is apps are great, but there is, you know, there is nothing like human connection in building trust with workers, and I think apps backed up by on the ground human contact and relationship building is often key to that synergy.
If I can try to contribute to the debate on this, in my view, and a little bit back to Cindy's question also, I think if we look at the positive developments, at least it is that we can see there are more organizations like Issara and others, I mean, being developed, and in that sense, we are kind of in the pioneering states in terms of both organizing ourselves within this field, working together with different multiple stakeholders, private sector organizations, government, and so on, and also with the technology development. So we are kind of at the early stage. So, but I see that as a positive thing, because now there's a different approach and potentially new and different, and they will be better solutions in the future. I don't think, based on what I've seen so far, that apps alone or technology alone at all can solve this problem or these issues. But that might be a matter of time. Things might change and beyond my imagination and so forth. But I do think, to use a kind of a military phrase, sometimes you need boots on the ground. You can send in drones, you can use technologies, but in the end, you need human contact, as you say, Tim, and you need boots on the ground. And I think it's also important that we should be careful about that. This whole development does not become a substitute for trade unions and strong trade unions. It's still very important for workers to actually to be unionized, and so I think this can be complemented, but it shouldn't replace it, and so forth. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Thanks so much, Anders. Great points made. And plenty of comments appreciating your comments, Anders. So, if there's no more on that, have we got any more? We're getting, well, you know, we've probably got another 10 minutes. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to voice in person? Please unmute yourselves and feel free to ask the panel a question. Has the panel got any comments that these questions have brought up in their minds that they'd like to make?
I was just going to say, if I could, Tim, I was just thinking about that, and that, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's certainly controversial area, particularly the fear that apps will replace proper and meaningful worker engagement and the role of trade unions and worker organizing on the ground. I think something that I've been thinking, though, also recently, is that when workers do come forward, they're taking a huge risk, and particularly if they are in a country on a seasonal or temporary migration scheme, and they only have a short amount of time to make back what is likely to be a huge debt to that individual that they have paid to travel and to come to a country. So when they, if they are seeking a remedy, it is very often to get into an alternative employment situation quickly to repay their debts and to make a bit of money and to get home. And but as we often find, that workers are very kindly also very keen to ensure that other workers and other people from their country do not face the same problems as they do. And so there is a kind of altruistic and a wider educational point for some workers wanting to come forward. And so I guess you need a multiplicity of mechanisms, right? You need workers to be able to talk to someone where they can try and achieve a tangible remedy immediately to their problem. And also you need a way of really getting a sense of what is going wrong in a supply chain or in a particular workplace. And I think they can kind of work together. And I think there is a role for something that it provides anonymity and doesn't cause any risk to workers if they don't want to take any risks in raising particular concerns. I would want to make sure that any app has is respected by businesses and those that hold the power in supply chains, and isn't seen as isn't doubted because of the anonymity. But yeah, I think if there's something that workers can trust, that if they raise cases, then it might make a difference. I was just looking for the name of the Centro del Derecho de Migrante. My Spanish is rubbish, sorry, Mike. But CDM in America has this brilliant app that workers use to review, like kind of TripAdvisor reviews, which we talk about a lot in this area, but to review labour providers. And I know that workers have really appreciated that, because it provides a certain amount of anonymity, and then it means that you can share with other workers the risks and have that kind of conversation without maybe putting yourself at risk and your potentially your anonymity at risk. So I can't quite remember the name of that, if anyone else can, but yeah, CDM run it, and it's used by workers to review labour providers. So yeah.
Yes, we've had similar experiences in Europe. In fact, social media without any involvement from even trade unions or NGOs has been used by various migrant populations to score the quality or lack thereof of employers. For example, in Holland, I'm thinking of various other situations like that, and has helped bring things forward. I want to just comment briefly on Patrick's question, because while I like to be positive, I think there's also sometimes reasons for being negative. Over a couple of decades, I have paid passing attention to Mediterranean agriculture, and particularly to products like wool, strawberries, tomatoes, oranges, where a little bit like in Florida with the Immokalee workers, the majority of farm workers are migrants. And in some cases, I'm thinking particularly of Italian agriculture in the very south of Italy, the level of noise sporadically at a level of complaint, of denunciation in the press in Italy, but also by various parts of the Ethical Trading Initiative and others, has been very high. And yet, both the basic problem, which is a little bit to do with mafia control, but also lack of action by brands and so on, has allowed the sector to survive without really any meaningful remedial action. And there, I think one has to look at the astonishing willingness of the state, of the government, to look the other way and or just not to take adequate action. And just in the last 12 months, I've seen very similar things elsewhere. Certainly in Spain, there was, for the nth time, a lot of bad publicity a couple of months ago about farms in Huelva in the southwest, just 6 months after a UN special rapporteur had named a California-based brand as condoning or being directly involved in extremely harsh treatment of agricultural workers. So there seem to be some cases where, because there's no progress, the rest of us, as it were, turn our attention somewhere else. I think that's partly down to a lack of will by governments to really push things forward, and an inclination when they have an important export sector to do as little as possible to rock the boat. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mike. I mean, we're getting close to the end of our time with everybody. I mean, maybe it's a good time for us to go through the panelists and anybody who's participating to start with some conclusions, recommendations, hopes for the future, and on a positive note. So I'm very happy to start with what I've got out of this. I think from my perspective, it would be great to see business really adopt some more multi-stakeholder systems in regard to access to remedy. You know, I think we all who've been involved in corporate life for a long time, should be beginning to realise that business to business systems don't work, and I would hope that business and government and other stakeholders start to work together to come up with some better systems. So, anybody else would like to add?
Maybe I'll go then.
No.
I was just going to echo what has been said a couple of times by panelists already, but I think it's an important point. There's a good takeaway, which is the importance of exploring ways in which new tools like various bits of technology can be introduced, but in a way that support what we already know works. That is, traditional organizing and trade unions. So that there is, kind of a mixed methods approach, I guess, where we are exploring new avenues to reach particularly vulnerable groups, but in a really careful worker-centered way that hopefully can support their ability to access their basic rights. I think there are some of the examples given speak very much to the importance of that approach, and some of the most sort of optimistic and forward-looking examples as well. So for me, that's a key takeaway to focus on.
Well, while we're still thinking, we have another question here that I think is pretty interesting, and something we haven't really touched on regarding, new mandatory due diligence, Modern Slavery Act, French Vigilance Act. Do the panelists have any views on on how this might affect the role of providing remedy? New legislation. Obviously, I think it's been a powerful, not as powerful as it should be, but it has been powerful regarding change, especially from a business perspective. And it'd be probably good to get some views on the panelists regarding legislation and their effect.
I think Ruggie was really helpful in spelling out what due diligence meant, and I find that reminding people of what was said there is endlessly useful, because what gets done or what gets written into modern slavery statements or various other assurances generally falls far short of what Ruggie was calling for. So I think that we still have to set the standard high enough to get meaningful due diligence. And part of that actually then applies to having the right grievance procedures in place. So not something that has been crafted by a communications expert and a company lawyer to sound beautiful, but to be completely inaccessible to a worker. but actually things that are shown publicly to function. I think we're still quite away from that.
I can say a few words. I can jump in. Can you hear me?
Please do, Anders.
Okay. This is maybe more like a hope than a recommendation. I think I hope that over time this will be beyond compliance, and of course there needs to be a legislative framework. But I also hope that more businesses over time will understand the value of effective grievance mechanisms and how it's important both for their own risk management, but also for their positive branding and so forth. And I think I would like actually to see more examples of what it's worth, also net worth. I mean, what it's worth in money. And I have one example that I worked on a couple of years ago. I won't go into the details of the case, that's too comprehensive at this point. But generally, we were working with a business who were affected by potential trafficking in their supply chains. And at first they didn't address it, and because they didn't address it in time, they actually got a lot of negative media reports and so on. So the long story short is that they had to restructure the whole business. They lost a lot of clients, and they had to get a new CEO. They changed the procedures and all these things. So I don't have the exact numbers here, but it cost them billions. And I think it'll be useful. Of course, businesses won't like to share that, but it'll be useful to see more examples of what it's worth, not only for the benefit of doing good or for compliance, but actually also in terms of reducing business risk and what it's worth to actually develop a sound and ethical supply chain.
And very, very interesting, Anders. I think it was Puma who developed the environmental profit and loss formula. It would be quite interesting to see if there was an alternative on the social side. Any more comments from anybody? We're 5 minutes over, so no pressure. I mean, we're pretty close to the end.
Yeah, so just, two things. So one is related to COVID-19. I guess we're just going back into a bit of a lockdown in Scotland at the moment, and I know England is too. And so we have a continued situation where workers are having very limited access, particularly workers in rural areas, but also in isolated sectors like fishing, very, very limited access to anyone outside their workplace. And so the real risks that COVID-19 is posing to access to remedy and to reporting channels, I think, need to be acknowledged and addressed urgently by those who are looking to ensure worker access to remedy, because this might seem short term to some people, but any exploitation is not really felt as a short term thing. And then the other thing, just to go back to what I mentioned about circular and temporary migration programs, I think really recognizing the risks to access to remedy, and that's for all of us to do, state and non-state actors, that new migration regimes and shifting worker statuses pose. So where a temporary migration program is introduced or advocated, then really making sure that resources are also incorporated for worker representation in workplaces, acknowledging that the usual methods that are used will not be nearly as accessible, and very unlikely for workers to, for example, join a trade union when they're coming to a country for 4 to 6 months and don't speak the language. And also acknowledging that the usual communication channels won't be available. So adding those resources for, like I was saying, 24-hour multilingual hotline, but then developing a really strong grievance process as well. So yeah, I think those kind of emerging risks, I guess I would point to. So things like COVID-19 at the moment that might seem like a blip, but has been going on for a very long time. Sometimes for some of the workers that I'm working with, for the entire time that they've been in the UK, and they might not have encountered any kind of assistance to raise any concerns. And then the other is addressing those changes to immigration frameworks or employment statuses, and incorporating protections where there are major changes.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Any more comments from anyone? And we're 8 minutes over now, and people are beginning, I think, have got other priorities that are beginning to leave us. So I'm going to wrap up soon. Panelists, anybody else got anything burning they'd like to add to the conversation? If not, thank you so much. Great panel. Thanks everybody for participating. Some great questions. Thanks again, panelists. Really do appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great evening or morning if you're in Asia. Afternoon if you're in the States. Have a good day, everybody, and thanks so much. I'm going to close the webinar now.